The world of the mid-14th century was a world of interconnected whispers, a vast web of silk and spice that stretched from the humid ports of the East to the cold, fog-drenched quays of northern Europe. And it is here, in the quiet hum of the trade winds, that our story begins. Imagine a map of the world as it was then, not defined by hard borders, but by the slow, rhythmic pulse of caravans crossing the Gobi Desert and ships hugging the rugged coastlines of the Indian Ocean. The sun sets over the great steppe, casting long, amber shadows across the grass, and in the burrows beneath the earth, a tiny hitchhiker is preparing to change the course of human history. This is Yersinia pestis, a bacterium so small it is invisible to the eye, yet it carries the weight of empires. It lives in the gut of the flea, and the flea lives in the fur of the marmot, and for centuries they lived in a balanced, isolated dance in the high plateaus of Central Asia. But the climate is shifting, the rains are failing, and the rodents are moving, searching for new lands, bringing their invisible passengers closer to the Silk Road. As the sun dips below the horizon of the year 1346, we find ourselves at the trading outpost of Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula. The air here smells of drying fish, expensive incense, and the sweat of 1,000 languages. The Genoese merchants have built thick stone walls to protect their wealth, but they cannot wall out the microscopic. Outside the walls, the Golden Horde, the Mongol warriors of Janibeg, are dying. They are falling not to arrows, but to a fever that turns their skin black and purple. In the stillness of the night, you can hear the creak of the trebuchets, but they are not launching stones. They are launching the heavy, lifeless bodies of the infected over the walls, a desperate and terrifying attempt to share their fate with the besieged. This is the moment the spark hits the tinder. The merchants, panicked and weeping, flee to their galleys. They haul up the anchors, the heavy iron chains clanking against the wood, and they set sail for the Mediterranean, unaware that they are carrying the end of the world in the grain sacks in their holds. The ships glide through the Black Sea, the water as dark and smooth as obsidian. The sailors lean against the rigging, watching the stars, feeling the first aches in their joints, the first swellings in their necks. By the time the ships reach the port of Messina in Sicily in October 1347, the death ships are silent. The people on the docks see the tethered sails and the erratic movement of the oars. When they board, they find a nightmare of the living and the dead huddled together. The plague has arrived in Europe. From the sun-drenched squares of Sicily, the sickness moves like a slow-moving tide of ink. It follows the trade routes, north through the mountain passes of the Alps, west along the sun-baked coast of France, and across the choppy, gray waters of the English Channel. In every town, the story is the same. A traveler arrives, a merchant opens a bale of cloth, a rat leaps from a gangplank, and within days the bells begin to toll. Listen to the sound of a medieval city at night, the distant bark of a dog, the rustle of straw in a stable, and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of a family huddled together for warmth. In London, the houses are built so close that the overhanging jetties almost touch, blocking out the moonlight. The streets are narrow veins of mud and waste, a perfect labyrinth for the black rat, Rattus rattus. These rats are not the coarse brown rats of the modern world, but sleek, agile climbers that live in the thatch of the roofs right above the heads of the sleeping. As the rats die from the plague, the fleas, deprived of their hosts, jump. They seek the warmth of human skin. A single bite, no more painful than a pinprick, and the bacteria begin their work. They travel to the nearest lymph node, multiplying by the millions, creating the bubo, a hard, painful swelling that marks the victim as one of the chosen. The physicians of the time are lost in a fog of ancient theories. They speak of Galen and Hippocrates, of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and they believe the body has fallen out of balance. They look to the sky and see the conjunction of three planets in the house of Aquarius, and they declare that the air itself has become corrupted, a miasma of poison. To protect themselves, they carry bouquets of flowers and herbs, meadowsweet, lavender, and crushed rose petals, pressing them to their noses as they walked past the piles of refuse. They do not know that the danger is not in the smell, but in the tiny, frantic movements of the insects in the rugs they stand upon. In the great hall of a manor house, the lord sits by the fire, drinking spiced ale, believing his high stone walls and his wealth will protect him. But death is no respecter of rank. The plague enters the palace as easily as the hovel. It takes the priest at the altar, the king in his chamber, and the beggar in the ditch. As the winter of 1448 turns to the spring of 1449, the mortality reaches heights that defy the imagination. In Florence, the city of art and light, the streets are empty of life but full of the dead. Boccaccio writes of how the living ceased to care for the dying, how the ties of blood and affection were snapped by the sheer weight of the terror. You can picture the dead carts moving through the cobblestone streets in the pre-dawn light, the drivers calling out, "Bring out your dead!" into the misty silence. The churchyards are full, and then the auxiliary pits are full, layers upon layers of humanity laid down like pages in a dark book, covered with a thin dusting of lime. And yet, in this vast silence, something is changing. The world that will emerge from this darkness will not be the world that entered it. The silence is not just the silence of death, it is the silence of a great transition, the labor pains of a new era. The fields go fallow because there is no one to plow them. The sheep wander untended across the hills of the Cotswolds. The price of grain drops because there are fewer mouths to feed, but the price of labor, the value of a human being's time and strength, begins to soar. The survivors look at their hands and realize they are no longer bound to the land by the old laws of feudalism. They have a power they never knew before. They demand wages, they move to the cities, they wear clothes that were once reserved for the nobility. The rigid, frozen hierarchy of the Middle Ages is beginning to melt, thawed by the heat of the fever. Even the church, once seen as the infallible bridge between heaven and earth, finds its foundation shaken. When the priests died as fast as the parishioners, people began to look for a more personal, direct connection to the divine. The seeds of the Reformation, the Renaissance, and the modern world are being sown in the very soil that holds the victims of the great mortality. The plague does not leave at once. It retreats into the shadows, waiting. It becomes a ghost that haunts the European psyche for 300 years. It returns in waves, 1361, 1374, 1383, never quite as devastating as the first, but always present, a reminder of the fragility of life. We see it again in the 1600s, in the Great Plague of London, where the red crosses are painted on doors, and the cry of "Lord, have mercy upon us" echoes through the deserted markets. The plague doctors, in their long leather coats and bird-like masks, their glass eyes reflecting the fires lit in the streets to purify the air. It is a world of shadows and superstition, yet through the gloom, the first flickers of modern science begin to appear. The Royal Society is formed. Men like Robert Hooke begin to look through lenses at the hidden world, though they are still centuries away from seeing the true face of the enemy. The year is now 1665, and the world has grown older, perhaps not much wiser in the face of the invisible enemy. The rhythmic rocking of the narrative shifts from the creaking medieval galley to the cobblestones of London, where the city is sweltering under an unusually hot and dry summer. You can feel the heavy, stagnant air pressing against the timber-framed houses of Cheapside and Holborn. The Thames has once been a silver ribbon of commerce, has become sluggish and foul, its banks lined with the refuse of a city that has grown too large for its own health. In the narrow alleys, the black rats are flourishing. They scurry behind the wainscoting of the alehouses and nest in the piles of discarded oyster shells. For 300 years, the plague has been a recurring ghost, a phantom that visits every generation. But this summer, the ghost has taken on a solid, terrifying form. Imagine the great cross of St. Paul's Cathedral shimmering in the heat. The wealthy have already begun to flee. The carriages of the nobility clog the roads leading to the countryside, their wheels churning up clouds of dust as they seek the safety of the open air. But for the hundreds of thousands who remain, the weavers, the watermen, the apprentices, the city has become a trap. The Lord Mayor has issued a grim decree. Any house touched by the sickness must be shut up for 40 days. A red cross is painted on the door, 1 foot high, with the solemn words, "Lord, have mercy upon us," inscribed above it. A watchman stands outside the door, day and night, ensuring that no one enters and no one leaves. Inside, families wait in the dim candlelight, listening to the buzzing of flies and the distant, rhythmic ringing of the bellman's handbell. The sound of that bell becomes the heartbeat of the city. Bring out your dead. It is a low, mournful toll that cuts through the heavy night air. The dead carts, their wheels ungreased and shrieking against the stones, move through the darkness to avoid the sight of the living. The drivers, often men who have already survived the sickness and believe themselves immune, wrap their faces in vinegar-soaked cloths. They carry the bodies to the great pits at Tooth Hill Fields or Bun Hill Fields, where the earth is opened wide to receive hundreds at a time. There are no individual headstones here, no elaborate funeral processions. There is only the soft thud of earth falling on earth and the prayers of a weary chaplain whispered into the void. During these long, suffocating months, we encounter a different kind of figure wandering the streets, the plague doctor. Picture a shadow moving through the mist, draped in a long coat of Moroccan leather that reaches his ankles, polished with suet to prevent the miasma from sticking to the fabric. On his head, he wears a wide-brimmed hat, but it is the mask that haunts the dreams of the Londoners. It is shaped like the beak of a giant bird, nearly half a foot long. Inside the beak, the doctor has stuffed dried flowers, camphor, cloves, and labdanum. He believes that by breathing through this fragrant filter, he can strain out the poisonous air. He carries a wooden wand to point to his patients and to keep the desperate at a distance. Through the round glass circles of his eyes, he watches a world that seems to be unraveling, unaware that the very leather he wears is protecting him not from the air, but from the fleas that cannot find a purchase on the slick, waxy surface. In a small room in the suburbs, a young man named Isaac Newton has fled the University of Cambridge to seek refuge at his family home in Woolsthorpe. The plague has closed the schools, sending the scholars into isolation. As the world outside succumbs to chaos, Newton sits in the quiet of his garden. The plague, in a strange twist of fate, has gifted him the Annus Mirabilis, the year of wonders. In the silence of his quarantine, he watches an apple fall. He deconstructs the colors of light with a prism, and he develops the foundations of modern physics. The plague, which brings an end to so many lives, provides the stillness required for the birth of modern physics. It is a reminder that even in the deepest winter of human suffering, the intellect continues to reach for the light. But the 17th century ends with a different kind of fire. In September 1666, a spark in a bake shop on Pudding Lane ignites a conflagration that cleanses London. The great fire roars through the city, consuming the ancient rat-infested timber houses and the filth of the medieval streets. When the city is rebuilt, it is built of brick and stone. The thatched roofs are gone, the streets are widened, and the black rat, the agile climber of the thatch, finds itself displaced by the brown rat, Rattus norvegiscus, which prefers the sewers and cellars, keeping a greater distance from the sleeping humans above. The plague begins to recede from Western Europe, not because of a cure, but because the world has physically changed. The theater of the great mortality is being dismantled piece by piece. The story then drifts across the centuries, past the Age of Enlightenment and into the 19th century. The world is becoming smaller. Steamships replace sailing vessels, and the Suez Canal opens a direct artery between the East and the West. In 1855, the third pandemic begins in the remote province of Yunnan, China. It moves like a slow-burning fire through the tin mines, eventually reaching Hong Kong in 1894. This is a different era, an era of microscopes and laboratories. Two men, Alexander Yersin and Shibasaburo Kitasuto, race against time in the sweltering heat of Hong Kong to find the cause. Yersin, working in a makeshift hut made of bamboo and straw, looks through his lens and sees it, a tiny ovoid bacterium, a rod-shaped organism that he names Pasteurella pestis, later renamed Yersinia pestis in his honor. The mystery that had terrified humanity for 1,500 years is suddenly stripped of its supernatural power. It is no longer a judgment from the stars or a corruption of the air. It is a biological entity, a living thing that can be studied, understood, and eventually defeated. The scene shifts to the 1940s, where the discovery of streptomycin provides the first true silver bullet. The Black Death is reduced from an apocalyptic horseman to a treatable infection. As the narrative of history settles, we look back at the trail left by this single bacterium. It shaped the fall of Rome, the end of the Middle Ages, the rise of the laboring class, and the birth of modern science. It lives on today in the quiet corners of the globe, in the prairie dogs of Arizona, the marmots of Mongolia, and the rats of Madagascar, but it no longer commands the terror of the bells. The sound you hear now is not the tolling of the dead, but the steady, rhythmic breathing of a world that has survived. The shadows of the past are long, but they are only shadows. The night is soft, the air is clean, and the long journey through the history of the plague has finally reached its peaceful end. You are safe, you are held in the present, and the history of the world is now just a lullaby, fading into the stillness of your sleep. The air grows colder now as we drift away from the sterile laboratories of the 19th century and back into the flickering torchlight of the medieval mind, where the plague was not a bacterium, but a sentient, wandering terror. In the high, thin air of the Scandinavian mountains and the deep, shadowed forests of Germany, the people did not speak of fleas or rats, they spoke of the pesta. Imagine a withered, silent old woman dressed in a black hooded cloak, traveling from farm to farm across the frozen fjords. In her gnarled hands, she carries a rake and a broom. This is the personification of the great mortality. When she reaches a homestead and uses her rake, some will survive, slipping through the wide wooden teeth of the implement. But when she reaches for her broom, every soul in the house is swept away into the silence of the earth. You can hear the rhythmic swish, swish of her phantom broom against the dry straw of the floorboards, a sound that haunted the dreams of generations, a lullaby of the inevitable. In the walled cities of Central Europe, the folklore took on even darker, more rhythmic forms. This is the era of the danse macabre, the dance of death. Picture the stone walls of a cathedral, lit by the guttering tallow candles of a midnight vigil. Painted upon the lime-washed walls is a long, winding procession. Skeletal figures, grinning with a mirthless, eternal joy, lead the living by the hand. They lead the Pope in his triple tiara, the Emperor in his ermine robes, the merchant with his scales, and the laborer with his spade. No one is exempt from the dance. The music is a silent, internal throb, a reminder that beneath the silk and the rags, everyone carries the same white bones. This was not a dance of despair, but a strange, grim comfort, a leveling of the world, where the poor finally found equality with the kings who had ruled them. The rhythm of the dance was the rhythm of the plague itself, a steady, unceasing march that beat against the heart of the world.
Further south, in the sun-drenched hill towns of Italy, the stories spoke of the Plague Maiden. She was said to be a beautiful, ethereal figure who stepped out of the morning mist, her breath a blue flame that withered the vines and turned the water in the wells to bitterness. She would pass through the gates of a city, invisible to all but those marked for the grave. In the folklore of the Balkans, the plague was a grandmother who had to be treated with the utmost terrified respect. People would leave out honey, wine, and clean linen on their doorsteps, hoping that if they were hospitable enough, the grandmother would pass their house by. They spoke in whispers, never saying her true name, calling her the guest or the kind one, a linguistic shield against the darkness. This habit of soft speaking, of hushed tones and careful movements became a cultural survival mechanism, a quietness that settled over the continent for centuries. Deep in the rural villages of England, the folklore merged with the landscape itself. There are plague stones still sitting in the grass today, large weathered boulders with circular hollows carved into their tops. During the height of the sickness, these stones were the only point of contact between the infected village and the healthy world. Imagine a farmer approaching the stone in the blue light of dawn. He places his coins into the hollow, which has been filled with vinegar to kill the seeds of the sickness. He retreats into the woods, and hours later, a merchant from the next town arrives, takes the vinegared coins, and leaves sacks of grain and salt. There is no speech, only the wind in the oaks and the clink of silver against stone. This silent commerce, this distance maintained by vinegar and stone, is the ancestor of our modern understanding of quarantine. It is a slow, methodical ritual that kept the world moving when the world wanted to stop. The stories also tell of the immortal doctors and the saints of the pestilence. Saint Sebastian, pierced by arrows, became a symbol for the plague because the suddenness of the infection felt like being struck by an invisible bolt from the sky. And then there is Saint Roch, who was said to have contracted the plague and retreated into the forest to die alone, only to be saved by a faithful hunting dog who brought him bread every day and licked his wounds until he was healed. The image of the dog and the bread became a symbol of hope, a belief that even in the most desolate isolation, nature might provide a companion, a flicker of mercy in the dark. You can see these images in the stained glass of quiet country churches, the colors of ruby and sapphire glowing as the sun sets, casting long, peaceful shadows across the pews. As the plague became a permanent part of the human story, it even seeped into the games of children.
Think of the nursery rhyme, Ring-a-Ring-a-Roses. Though historians debate its direct origins, the imagery is a vivid map of the 14th century experience. The pocket full of posies to ward off the smell, the ashes, representing the falling of the world or the burning of the dead, and finally, the all fall down, the collective collapse of a society under the weight of the invisible. It is a haunting thought that a tragedy of such magnitude could be distilled into a playground song, a rhythmic chant passed down through centuries until the original terror was worn smooth like a pebble in a stream, becoming a harmless part of childhood. The story ends not with a bang, but with a slow fading into the mist. As the Enlightenment took hold and the microscope revealed the flea and the bacterium, the pesta and the plague maiden retreated into the realm of fairy tales. They became the monsters under the bed, the bogeymen used to keep children from wandering too far into the woods at night. But the lessons they taught of the fragility of life, the importance of community, and the equality of all people in the face of nature remained. The rhythm of the story is now one of peace. The rake and the broom are leaned against the wall. The dance of death has slowed to a gentle sway. The blue flame of the maiden's breath has flickered out, replaced by the steady, warm glow of a hearth fire. You are drifting further now, the history of the plague becoming a soft tapestry of myth and memory. The heavy stone walls of the medieval town are dissolving into the soft clouds of sleep. The tolling bells are silenced, replaced by the white noise of the wind in the pines. The world is large, the world is old, and you are a part of its long, enduring breath. The stories of the past are settled, their lessons learned, their terrors spent. The night is deep. The shadows are kind, and the long, winding road through the history of the great mortality has brought you here to this moment of absolute stillness, where the only thing left to do is let go and fall into the waiting arms of rest. The landscape of the world is a palimpsest, a parchment that has been written upon, erased, and written upon again. But if you look closely at the rolling hills of the English Midlands or the dense emerald forests of Germany, you can see the scars left by the great mortality. These are the lost villages, the deserted medieval villages that the plague emptied of life and time eventually reclaimed. Imagine standing on a high ridge at twilight, looking down into a field that appears at first glance to be nothing more than a pasture for sheep. But as the sun sinks lower, the long shadows reveal the ridge and furrow patterns of ancient plowing and the rectangular hollows where houses once stood. This is the architecture of absence. Here, the rhythm of life, the morning call to the cattle, the scent of wood smoke, the communal labor of the harvest, stopped so abruptly that the earth itself seemed to hold its breath. In the mid-1300s, there were thousands of these thriving communities, places like Warham Percy or Gainsthorpe, where the social fabric was woven tight. But when the plague struck a small, isolated village, the results were often total. It was not always that everyone died. Sometimes the survivors simply looked at the empty hearths of their neighbors and realized they could no longer maintain the walls, the church, or the fields. They walked away, leaving the keys in the doors, taking only what they could carry. You can almost hear the rhythmic creak of a lone gate swinging in the wind, a village becoming a ghost in real time. Over decades, the thatched roofs caved in under the weight of the winter snow. The stone walls tumbled as the roots of hawthorn and ash pushed through the mortar. The forest, patient and unceasing, began to march back into the gardens. Today, these sites are silent, grassy mounds, a quiet testament to a demographic collapse that shifted the very gravity of the continent. To walk through these archaeological ghosts is to touch the heartbeat of a lost world. In the abandoned churches of East Anglia, you might find plague graffiti scratched into the stone pillars, hasty, desperate prayers, or tallies of the dead, hidden away from the light of day. There is a specific stillness in these places, a quality of air that feels heavy with the memory of the 14th century. In some villages, the entire layout was shifted. The survivors moved the village center half a mile away to higher, cleaner ground, leaving the old site to be swallowed by the brambles. This physical movement was a manifestation of a deep ancestral fear, a belief that the ground itself could hold the seeds of the pestilence. And in a way, they were right. The bacteria lived in the fleas, and the fleas lived in the nests of the rats beneath the floorboards. To move was to break the cycle. In the mountains of the Pyrenees and the Alps, the plague left behind San Roque chapels, lonely stone structures built at the entrances to high valleys. These were the sentinels of the plague era. Travelers would be stopped there, forced to wait in the thin, cold air for days to prove they didn't carry the fever. You can imagine the traveler sitting by a small peat fire, watching the stars through the doorway of the chapel, the only sound the distant clang of a goat's bell. This was the birth of the lazaretto system, the beginning of the world's organized defense against contagion. It was a slow, rhythmic waiting, a period of purgatory between the healthy world and the infected one. The isolation was a physical weight, a silence that stretched across the mountain passes. The plague also changed the very color of the European landscape. Before the Black Death, the continent was a patchwork of small, labor-intensive grain fields. But with the population decimated, there were no longer enough hands to sow and reap the wheat. The landowners turned to sheep farming, which required fewer men and more open space. The golden fields of grain were replaced by the endless green of the sheep walks. The landscape became lonelier, more pastoral, and more quiet. The rhythmic thwack of the scythe was replaced by the soft bleating of the flocks and the whistle of the lone shepherd. This shift created the English countryside we recognize today, the hedgerows, the stone walls, and the wide, rolling commons. It is a landscape born of a vacuum, a beauty constructed on the site of a tragedy. But let us drift deeper into the earth, beneath the green grass of the lost villages, to the plague pits that lie beneath our modern cities. In 2013, during the construction of the Crossrail line in London, workers at Charterhouse Square uncovered a layer of history they hadn't expected. They found the skeletons of the 1348 outbreak laid out with surprising care. Despite the chaos of the time, these people were not simply tossed away. They were placed in rows, their heads facing east, waiting for a resurrection they believed was certain. The science of the 21st century was able to extract the ancient DNA from the teeth of these skeletons, confirming the presence of Yersinia pestis and proving that the strain that killed them is remarkably similar to the one that exists today. It is a profound rhythmic connection across the centuries, a bridge of bone and bacteria that links the modern commuter to the medieval laborer. The story of the lost villages is a story of resilience as much as loss. For every village that vanished, another survived and transformed. The Black Death was the fire that forged the modern world, clearing away the old stagnant structures of the past to make room for something new. Their survivors were stronger, better fed, and more mobile. They were the ancestors of the Renaissance, the explorers of the New World, and the builders of the Industrial Revolution. Their blood is your blood. The silence of the lost villages is not the silence of a grave, but the silence of a fallow field waiting for the next season to begin. The history of the plague is now settling into the deepest layers of your mind. The rake, the broom, the red cross, and the stone chapel are all fading into the soft, gray mist of the past. The shadows of the ridge and furrow fields are dissolving. The rhythmic tolling of the bell is gone, replaced by the deep, steady pulse of your own heart. The world is at rest. The earth has reclaimed what was lost, and the stories of the great mortality are tucked away in the archives of time. You are drifting in a calm sea of history, where the waves are small and the shore is distant. The night is a blanket, the silence is a gift, and you are free to wander the quiet pathways of sleep, where the only sound is the gentle, unceasing whisper of the stars. To truly understand the weight of the great mortality, we must step away from the maps and the grand statistics and enter the life of a single soul. Let us follow the rhythmic footsteps of a man named Thomas, a clerk living in the parish of St. Giles in the Fields during the sweltering July of 1665. The sun rises over London not with a golden glow, but with a heavy, brassy heat that seems to press the very breath out of the lungs. As Thomas wakes, the first sound he hears is not the usual bustle of the market, but an eerie, hollow silence. The birds have stopped singing in the eaves. The only rhythm is the steady clack-clack of a single shutter beating across the way, a house that has been nailed shut for a week. Thomas rises from his pallet, his movements slow and deliberate. He washes his face with vinegar, the sharp acidic scent stinging his nostrils, a scent that has become the perfume of the city. Every action is a ritual of defense. He dresses in a linen shirt he has smoked over a fire of dried wormwood, believing the bitter fumes will repel the seeds of the sickness. As he steps out into the street, the world feels strangely elastic, as if time itself has slowed. He walks in the very center of the road, keeping as much distance as possible from the timber-fleshed walls of the houses, fearing the miasma that might cling to the wood. The street is a gallery of the desperate. He passes a woman sitting on a mounting block, her head buried in her hands. She is not crying, she is beyond tears, simply waiting for the heat to pass or the fever to take her. Further down, he sees a man painting a red cross on a door with a steady, practiced hand. The red ochre is thick and bright, a vivid scar against the weathered oak. Thomas ducks his head and quickens his pace, his leather soles slapping rhythmically against the cobbles. He is heading toward the apothecary, a small shop where the windows are packed with dried bundles of rue and valerian. Inside the shop, the air is thick with the scent of crushed minerals and herbs. The apothecary, a man with eyes tired from lack of sleep, hands Thomas a small tin of London treacle, a complex concoction of 64 ingredients, including opium, honey, and the flesh of vipers. It is a placebo, a hollow shield against a microscopic sword, but Thomas clutches it like a talisman. This is the psychological rhythm of the plague, the constant, frantic search for a cure that does not exist, the need to feel that one is doing something, anything, to keep the darkness at bay. As the afternoon heat reaches its zenith, Thomas walks towards the Thames. The river is a city's great artery, but today it is clogged with the boats of families living on the water, hoping the clean air of the river will protect them. He sits on a stone piling and watches the tide go out. He thinks of his brother in the countryside, of the smell of new-mown hay and the cool shade of the oak trees. The plague is the thief of the future. It forces a man to live entirely in the present, in the next breath, the next heartbeat. He feels the pulse in his own neck, steady, rhythmic, reassuring. For today, he is a survivor. As evening falls, the character of the city shifts. The heat does not dissipate, it merely turns blue and bruised. This is when the searchers of the dead, usually poor elderly women hired by the parish, move from house to house. They carry white wands and speak in hushed tones, identifying the cause of death for the official bills of mortality. Thomas hears their footsteps, a slow, dragging cadence. He retreats to his room and lights a single candle. He spends his evening writing in his journal, his quill scratching rhythmically against the parchment. He records the prices of bread, the names of the neighbors who have vanished, and the strange dreams he had of a white horse galloping through the empty streets of the Royal Exchange. The night brings the sound of the carts. "Bring out your dead." The cry is low and rhythmic, almost like a chant. Thomas closes his eyes and tries to focus on the sound of his own breathing. He imagines his breath as a tide, pulling in peace and pushing out fear. The history of the plague is not just a history of death, it is a history of the endurance of the human spirit. It is the story of the clerk who keeps his accounts, the mother who stays with her child, and the doctor who refuses to flee. It is a story of countless individual pulses that together form the heartbeat of a world that refused to stop beating. You are drifting now with Thomas into the cool, dark shadows of the 17th century. The sounds of London, the carts, the bells, the rustle of the parchment are all softening, merging into a single low hum. The heat of the day is gone, replaced by the velvet chill of the night. You are safe in your own time, in your own bed, but you carry with you the strength of those who walked before you. The history of the great mortality is settling into the earth, and you are floating above it, light and unburdened. The rhythm of the past is a lullaby, and as the candle in Thomas's room flickers out, the world of sleep opens.
In the flickering amber glow of a tallow candle, we shift our gaze from the clerk to the physician. It is 1665, and Dr. Nathaniel Hodges sits in his study, his quill hovering over a page of parchment. Outside, the night air is thick with the smoke of bonfires lit at every street corner, huge, crackling pyres of sea coal and sulfur intended to correct the air. The rhythm of his life has become a relentless, measured march against the clock of the pestilence. Every morning, before the sun has even cleared the soot-stained chimneys of London, he begins his ritual of fortification. He drinks a draught of sack, a fortified wine infused with wormwood, and places a piece of myrrh beneath his tongue. This is the sensory world of the 17th century scientist, a world of bitter tastes, pungent smells, and a desperate rhythmic adherence to a self-imposed discipline. Imagine the doctor's walk through the city. He does not wear the bird mask of the continent. He trusts in his silver-headed cane and his bottle of vinegar. As he enters the home of a patient, the sound of his footsteps on the stairs is the only thing that breaks the heavy, expectant silence of the sick room. He approaches the bed where the light is dim and the air is stifling. He does not see bacteria through a lens. He sees the struggle of the vital spirits. He reaches out to feel a pulse, a thin, wiry rhythm that flutters like a trapped bird against the patient's wrist. To Dr. Hodges, this pulse is a language. He listens to the rhythm of the heart, trying to discern if the body's internal heat is natural or preternatural. He records these observations with a cold, clinical precision that masks a profound, quiet empathy. The physician's work is a study in patterns. He notices how the sickness strikes the crowded, damp tenements of St. Giles first, moving like a slow, invisible fire toward the wealthier parishes. He notes the weather, the long, biting frost of the previous winter, followed by a stagnant, breathless summer. He is searching for the primum mobile, the first cause. In his journals he writes of the pax pestilentialis, the peace of the pestilence, where the usual noises of commerce are replaced by the rhythmic tolling of the parish bells. He is a man caught between two worlds, the ancient world of Galenic humors and the dawning world of empirical observation. He is a pioneer of the scientific revolution, standing in the middle of a graveyard, trying to build a ladder out of the darkness. As the night deepens, we see him back in his study, dissecting the day's tragedies. He looks at the bills of mortality, the weekly broadsheets that list the causes of death, consumption, grief, teeth, and finally, the plague. The numbers are rising. 2,000, then 4,000, then 7,000 deaths in a single week. The rhythm of the statistics is a drumbeat of doom, yet he continues to write. He describes the buboes not as curses, but as the body's own attempt to expel the poison. He advocates for cleanliness, for the venting of rooms, and for the courageous care of the sick. He is the guardian of the city's sanity, a rhythmic presence of order in a world that has lost its mind. The physician's journey is one of profound isolation. He cannot embrace his colleagues. He cannot sit long in an alehouse. He is a man marked by his proximity to death. Yet in this isolation, there is a deep, resonant peace. He finds solace in the order of his books and the steady, unceasing flow of his thoughts. He represents the human desire to understand the why of suffering. As he eventually blows out his candle, the smoke curls into the dark, a thin, rhythmic ribbon of gray. The physician's work is done for the night, but the legacy of his observations remains, a foundation for the doctors of the future who will finally see the flea and the bacterium. You are drifting now into the quietude of the doctor's library. The scent of old leather, dried herbs, and vinegar is fading into the clean, cool air of sleep. The frantic pulse of the city has slowed to a rhythmic, peaceful throb. The records are closed, the journals are shelved, and the long, heroic struggle of the early scientists is now just a distant murmur in the hall of history. You are surrounded by the wisdom of the ages, a quiet, protective layer of knowledge that keeps the shadows at bay. The night is long, the bed is warm, and you are sinking into a deep, scholarly rest, where the only rhythm is the gentle, steady beat of a heart that knows it is safe. The scene shifts now from the narrow, soot-stained streets of London to the wide, shimmering expanse of the Venetian lagoon. The air is different here, salt-heavy, cool, and smelling of the deep Adriatic. It is the 15th century, and Venice is the golden hinge between the East and the West. But this beauty comes with a price. Every galley that returns from Constantinople or Alexandria carries the potential for ruin. To protect the most serene republic, the Venetians have devised a system of rhythmic isolation. Imagine a small rocky island rising out of the mist, the Lazaretto Vecchio. Here, the concept of the quarantine, derived from the Italian 40 giorni, or 40 days, is born. You are a sailor on a Venetian merchant ship. The long voyage is over, and the domes of St. Mark's are visible in the distance, a mirage of gold and marble.
But the ship does not dock at the busy quays. Instead, it is intercepted by a swift-moving patrol boat. The health officers, draped in heavy robes, order your vessel to drop anchor near the island of the Lazaretto. For the next 40 days, your world will be defined by the rhythmic lap of the tide against the hull and the passage of the sun across the salt marshes. This is the time between, a purgatory of waiting where the only mission is to stay alive. Life on the quarantine island is a slow, methodical ritual. The cargo, bales of silk, sacks of pepper, and crates of fine porcelain are unloaded into massive stone warehouses with high, vaulted ceilings. To purify the goods, workers light fires of aromatic herbs, rosemary, juniper, and laurel. You watch the rhythmic plumes of blue smoke rising from the warehouse windows, swirling in the sea breeze. The Venetians believe the smoke will chase away the seeds of the pestilence. You, the sailors, are housed in long stone dormitories. Each morning begins with a bell, signaling the arrival of the supply boat. It stays at a distance, sliding crates of bread, wine, and salted fish onto a wooden pier before rowing away. There is no touch, no embrace, only the rhythmic exchange of necessities across a gap of water. In the quiet of the Lazaretto, the mind begins to wander. You spend hours watching the crabs scuttle across the mudflats at low tide, their movements a tiny frantic rhythm in the vast silence. You watch the stars, the same stars that guided you across the Mediterranean, now cold and indifferent observers of your isolation. This is the psychological heart of the plague history, the forced stillness. For centuries, humanity had been a species of movement, of expansion and trade, but the plague forced the world to stop. It created a culture of the long wait. In these 40 days, the sailor becomes a philosopher, reflecting on the fragility of the threads that connect the world's ports. But the Lazaretto is also a place of strange, haunting beauty. At night, the bioluminescence in the lagoon flickers like underwater stars as the tide moves through the seagrass. You hear the rhythmic call of the marsh owls and the distant, muffled sound of the bells from the city of Venice itself, a city so close you could almost reach out and touch it, yet as far away as the moon. The quarantine is a fortress of time. If by the 30th day no one has fallen ill, the tension begins to lift. The heartbeat of the crew settles into a more hopeful cadence. You begin to polish the brass and mend the sails, preparing for the moment when the yellow flag of the plague is finally lowered.
The Venetian system was the first of its kind, a recognition that the rhythm of trade must be balanced by the rhythm of safety. They built Lazaretto Nuovo, a second island for those who were merely suspected of being ill, creating a tiered system of defense that would eventually be copied by every port in the world, from New York to Marseille. This is the maritime legacy of the Great Mortality, the creation of the border not as a wall, but as a period of time. The ocean, which brought the sickness, also provided the space for the cure of isolation. You are drifting now, the rocking of the Venetian galley becoming the rocking of your own bed. The salt air is fading, replaced by the soft, warm scent of the indoors. The stone warehouses of the Lazaretto are dissolving into the shadows of your room. The 40 days are over, the vigil is done. The tides of the Adriatic are pulling back, leaving a shore of perfect silver sand. You are free from the quarantine of the past, moving into the open sea of a deep and peaceful sleep. The stars are bright, the water is calm, and the long rhythmic history of the world's islands is now just a whisper in the dark, guiding you home. The silence of the quarantine island begins to hum with a new sound, a low and resonant vibration that rises from the very soul of a wounded continent.
As we leave the salt spray of the Venetian lagoon, we enter the candlelit cathedrals and the dusty ateliers of the late 14th and 15th centuries. The plague did not just take lives, it took the old way of seeing the world and shattered it like a glass vessel. In the wake of the great mortality, art and music underwent a rhythmic transformation, shifting from the rigid, flat icons of the early Middle Ages to a visceral, pulsing realism that reflected the fragility of the human form. This is the era of the ars moriendi, the art of dying, where the rhythm of the brush and the cadence of the choir became a way to process the unspeakable. Imagine a painter standing before a vast wooden panel in a studio in Siena. Before the plague, he might have painted saints with golden halos, distant and serene, floating in a sea of unchanging blue. But now his hand moves with a different energy. He paints the triumph of death. He depicts a skeletal rider on a pale horse galloping over the bodies of kings and beggars alike. The lines are sharper, the colors more earthy, deep ochres, bruised purples, and the stark white of bone. This was not an obsession with the macabre for its own sake, but a rhythmic attempt to harmonize with reality. The art of this period began to breathe. It showed the strain of muscles, the hollow of a cheek, and the tear in an eye. The plague forced humanity to look at itself in the mirror, and the reflection was one of exquisite, temporary beauty. Listen to the shift in the music. Before the black ships arrived in Messina, the music of the church was often the Gregorian chant, a single, monophonic line that soared like a lark in a clear sky, timeless and ethereal. But as the century turned, a new rhythm emerged. Polyphony. Imagine multiple voices weaving together, rising and falling in a complex, interlocking dance. This was the ars nova, the new art. In the darkened naves of the cathedrals, the music began to mirror the complexity of a world that had seen the suddenness of death. The voices don't just sing, they sigh, they weep, and they resolve into triumphant harmonies. This rhythmic layering was a sonic representation of the human community, individual voices lost in the plague, now finding a way to harmonize in a larger, enduring song. It is a lullaby for a civilization, a steady, polyphonic heartbeat that carries the listener through the darkness. In the village squares, a different kind of art took hold, the theater of the street. The miracle plays and morality plays became a rhythmic part of the calendar. Actors dressed as death, as greed, and as mercy would perform on wooden wagons, their voices echoing off the stone walls of the guild halls. The dialogue was written in rhyming couplets, a steady, hypnotic meter that drummed the lessons of the era into the minds of the survivors. Life is fleeting, the hour is uncertain. Be kind while the sun shines. This rhythmic repetition served as a social anchor, a way for people to feel that there was still a script to follow, even when the world felt scriptless. You can hear the rhythmic thud of the actors' boots on the wooden boards, a sound that says, "We are still here, we are still moving, we are still telling our story." This period also saw the birth of the danse macabre in visual form, not just as folklore, but as massive murals on the walls of cemetery cloisters. Picture the Cimetière des Innocents in Paris, where a long painting stretched across the stone arches. It depicted a rhythmic line of people, a dupe, a monk, a child, a clerk, each paired with a dancing skeleton. The skeletons are not frightening, they are lithe and graceful, leading the living in a circular, never-ending dance. This was the great leveler. The rhythm of the dance reminded the peasant that his soul was as valuable as the bishop's. It was a rhythmic protest against the hierarchies of the past, a visual manifestation of a new, hard-won social equality. As the Renaissance blossomed, this preoccupation with death evolved into a deep, rhythmic appreciation for life. The memento mori, the skull on the scholar's desk, was not a sign of despair, but a reminder to live with intensity and purpose. The art of the late Renaissance, with its mastery of light and shadow, was a direct descendant of the plague's darkness. The chiaroscuro of Caravaggio, the deep, soulful portraits of Rembrandt, these were the fruits of a culture that understood the value of a single flickering candle in a vast, night-filled room. The rhythm of the art became the rhythm of the human pulse, light and dark, breath and silence, life and its inevitable, peaceful conclusion. You are drifting now into a gallery of the mind. The colors of the Sienese masters are softening into the velvet grays of sleep. The polyphonic voices of the choir are receding, their harmonies blending into a single, low hum of contentment. The dancing skeletons have finished their round and have laid down to rest in the cool earth. The ars moriendi has become the ars dormiendi, the art of falling asleep. You are surrounded by beauty that has survived the fire, by music that has weathered the storm. The long, rhythmic history of human creativity is a warm cloak wrapped around you, protecting you, comforting you. The world is a masterpiece of endurance, and you are a vital part of its composition. Sleep now to the rhythm of the ages, as the last candle in the atelier flickers out, and the stars take up their silent, eternal vigil. The silence of the quarantine island begins to hum with a new sound, a low and resonant vibration that rises from the very soul of a wounded continent. As we leave the salt spray of the Venetian lagoon, we enter the candlelit cathedrals and the dusty ateliers of the late 14th and 15th centuries. The plague did not just take lives, it took the old way of seeing the world and shattered it like a glass vessel. In the wake of the great mortality, art and music underwent a rhythmic transformation, shifting from the rigid, flat icons of the early Middle Ages to a visceral, pulsing realism that reflected the fragility of the human form. This is the era of the ars moriendi, the art of dying, where the rhythm of the brush and the cadence of the choir became a way to process the unspeakable. Imagine a painter standing before a vast wooden panel in a studio in Siena. Before the plague, he might have painted saints with golden halos, distant and serene, floating in a sea of unchanging blue. But now his hand moves with a different energy. He paints the triumph of death. He depicts a skeletal rider on a pale horse galloping over the bodies of kings and beggars alike. The lines are sharper, the colors more earthy, deep ochres, bruised purples, and the stark white of bone. This was not an obsession with the macabre for its own sake, but a rhythmic attempt to harmonize with reality. The art of this period began to breathe. It showed the strain of muscles, the hollow of a cheek, and the tear in an eye. The plague forced humanity to look at itself in the mirror, and the reflection was one of exquisite, temporary beauty. This period also saw the birth of the danse macabre in visual form, not just as folklore, but as massive murals on the walls of cemetery cloisters. Picture the Cimetière des Innocents in Paris, where a long painting stretched across the stone arches. It depicted a rhythmic line of people, a duke, a monk, a child, a clerk. In this colder world, the rhythm of human survival changed once again. People began to huddle closer to their hearths. The architecture of the home evolved to keep the warmth in. The high, drafty halls of the Middle Ages gave way to smaller rooms with lower ceilings and heavy wool hangings. This physical intimacy, born of the cold, created a new kind of interior life. It was during these long, frozen winters that the tradition of storytelling by the fire reached its peak. The rhythmic crackle of the logs and the whistling of the wind in the chimney became the backdrop for a culture that valued the hearth above all else. The Little Ice Age fostered a spirit of endurance, a quiet, stoic rhythm of life that prepared humanity for the rigors of the modern age. The forests that regrew during this time also became a sanctuary for wildlife that had been pushed to the brink. The wolf, the boar, and the stag returned to lands they had not trodden for centuries. The rhythm of the hunt changed. The forest was no longer a resource to be exploited, but a mysterious, powerful entity that commanded respect. This environmental shift even changed the wood that was available to craftsmen. The trees that grew during the slow, cold years of the Little Ice Age produced denser, more resonant timber. It is said that the extraordinary sound of a Stradivarius violin is partly due to the specific density of the wood grown during these cold centuries, a rhythmic vibration of the Earth's history captured in the grain of a musical instrument. As you drift through this green and frozen landscape, imagine the planet itself breathing. The surge of the forest was a long, slow inhalation, a cooling breath that stabilized the world after the fever of the pandemic. The earth has its own rhythms, its own cycles of fever and recovery, and the history of the plague is a chapter in that larger planetary pulse. The lost villages are now the roots of great oaks. The abandoned fields are the mossy floors of silent woods. The cold is not a threat, but a quiet, preserving force, a blanket of snow that keeps the world tucked in, waiting for a distant spring. You are floating now above the white-capped peaks of the Alps and the deep, dark forests of the north. The air is crisp and clean, the silence is absolute, and the rhythmic cycle of the seasons is a reassuring heartbeat. The history of the great mortality has become a history of the Earth's resilience. The world is large, the forests are deep, and you are sheltered in the quiet of a long winter night. The fire in the hearth is a glowing ember. The frost on the window pane is a delicate lace, and you are sinking into a deep, crystalline rest, where the only rhythm is the slow, majestic turning of the planet beneath the cold and watchful stars. The chill of the Little Ice Age lingers in the air, but beneath the frost, the social soil of Europe is beginning to churn with a new, rhythmic energy. As the forests reclaimed the abandoned fields, the people who remained, the survivors of the fever, found themselves standing in a world where the old rules no longer made sense. This is the story of the Great Shift, the moment when the heavy, immobile chains of feudalism began to rust and snap, replaced by the pulse of a fledgling middle class and the first true demands for human liberty. The plague had been a grim reaper, but in its wake it became a great leveler, turning the rhythmic toil of the serf into a valuable commodity. Imagine a peasant named Piers in the year 1350, standing in a muddy field in the English Midlands. Before the great mortality, Piers was little more than a piece of the landscape, bound to the lord of the manor by a rigid ancestral rhythm of boon work and week work. He owed his labor, his grain, and even his daughter's marriage fees to the land. But now, as he looks across the valley, he sees only silence. The neighboring manors are empty, the bailiffs are dead, the fields are overgrown. For the first time in 1,000 years, there are more jobs than there are men to fill them. Piers feels a new rhythm in his chest, not the rhythm of the slave, but the rhythm of the negotiator. When the lord of the manor demands that Piers harvest the wheat for the same meager pittance as before, Piers does something revolutionary. He says no. He knows that 3 miles away, another lord is desperate enough to pay double in cold, hard silver. This was the birth of the labor market. The rhythmic movement of people across the landscape, once strictly forbidden, became a flood. Peasants slipped away in the night, walking towards towns and cities, seeking the air of the city, which, according to the law of the time, made a man free if he could stay for a year and a day. You can hear the rhythmic thud of thousands of boots on the dirt roads, a sound of migration that signaled the end of the medieval world. The kings and the nobles tried to stop the clock. In 1351, the English Parliament passed the Statute of Laborers, a desperate attempt to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and to ban the movement of workers. It was a law written in anger, a rhythmic lashing out against the tide of history. But you cannot legislate away the laws of supply and demand. The more the state tried to suppress the workers, the more the workers felt their own collective power. This tension built up over decades, a slow-burning fuse that eventually led to the rhythmic clashing of steel during the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. When Wat Tyler and his followers marched on London, they weren't just asking for more money, they were asking for the end of serfdom itself. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? They chanted, a rhythmic, rhyming challenge to the very idea of nobility. This era saw the rise of the yeoman, the independent farmer who owned his own land and answered to no one but the law. The rhythm of the countryside changed from the collective, forced labor of the village strip fields to the individual, prideful labor of the private farm. This independence trickled into the cities, where the guilds of weavers, blacksmiths, and stonemasons grew in power. They created their own laws, their own rhythmic cycles of apprenticeship and mastery, and their own social safety nets. The middle class was being hammered into existence on the anvil of the plague, a new rhythmic heartbeat for a society that was learning to value the individual. Even the law itself became more rhythmic and structured. To handle the endless disputes over land and inheritance left by the dead, the courts became more professional. The use of English began to replace the use of French and Latin in legal proceedings, making the law something that the common man could finally hear and understand. The common law began to take its modern shape, a rhythmic accumulation of precedents and rights that would eventually cross the oceans to form the basis of modern democracies. The plague had inadvertently cleared the ground for the Magna Carta to truly breathe, turning a document for barons into a shield for the people. You are drifting now through the halls of history, where the sound of the quill on parchment is a steady, reassuring rhythm. The old, heavy shadows of the feudal manor are retreating, replaced by the bright, bustling energy of a marketplace. The chains are gone. The road is open. The history of the great mortality is, in the end, a history of human rising. The survivors did not just bury the dead, they built a world that was more fair, more mobile, and more free. The rhythmic pulse of liberty is a drumbeat that started in the silence of the plague-stricken villages and has never stopped beating.
The night is quiet now. The struggles of the past settled into the peaceful records of time. You are a descendant of this freedom, a part of this long, rhythmic march toward the light. The laws are written, the rights are won, and the world is at peace. Sleep now, knowing that the foundation beneath you is strong, built by the hands of those who saw the dark and chose to walk toward the dawn. The stars are constant, the earth is steady, and you are drifting into a deep, liberated rest, where the only rhythm is the gentle, unceasing flow of time.
The heavy parchment of the law books closes with a satisfying rhythmic thud, and we move from the halls of Parliament back into the quiet, steam-filled rooms of the apothecary and the physician. The evolution of medicine in the wake of the plague is a story of a slow, rhythmic awakening, a transition from a world of magic and humors to a world of observation and evidence. For centuries, the human response to the pestilence was a desperate, intuitive dance. One of the most enduring legends of this time is that of the 4 thieves' vinegar. Imagine 4 men in the plague-stricken city of Marseille, brazenly robbing the houses of the dead, yet never falling ill themselves. When finally captured, they traded their secret for their lives, a potent infusion of wormwood, meadowsweet, sage, and cloves in white wine vinegar. They would douse their bodies in this acidic armor before entering the shadows. This marks a rhythmic shift in human thought, the realization that protection could be found in the physical world, in the chemistry of plants, and the ritual of cleansing. As the centuries rolled on, the rhythm of medical discovery moved from the kitchen to the laboratory. We find ourselves in the late 17th century, where the father of microbiology, Antony van Leeuwenhoek, is sitting at a wooden desk in Delft, grinding tiny glass lenses with a rhythmic circular motion of his hand. He is a draper by trade, but his curiosity is a silent fire. He takes a drop of stagnant water and looks through his lens, and for the first time in human history, the animalcules are seen. He sees a world of tiny, thrashing life, microscopic organisms that have existed since the dawn of time, invisible and unheeded. Though he does not yet connect these tiny creatures to the plague, the rhythmic ticking of his microscope lens marks the beginning of the end for the miasma theory. The invisible enemy has finally been caught in the light. The story then flows into the 18th and 19th centuries, where the rhythm of medicine becomes more clinical and courageous. We see the first tentative steps toward vaccination, beginning not with the plague, but with its cousin in terror, smallpox. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu brings the practice of variolation from the Ottoman Empire to London, a rhythmic process of introducing a tiny amount of the sickness to the body to teach it how to fight. This was a revolutionary idea, that the body itself was a battlefield and could be trained. The medical mind was beginning to understand the rhythm of immunity, the way the blood remembers a foe. By the time the 3rd pandemic of the plague struck in the 1990s, the scientific world was prepared. Imagine the laboratory in Hong Kong where Alexandra Yersin is working. The rhythm here is one of high-stakes precision. He is competing with Kitasato Shibasaburo, both men peering through their microscopes, searching for the culprit. Yersin notices something the others missed. The bacteria thrive in a slightly cooler environment. He isolates the rod-shaped organism from the lymph nodes of a victim, and the ghost is finally named Yersinia pestis. This discovery was the final drumbeat in a war that had lasted 1,500 years. Once the bacterium was identified, the rhythm of the response became one of sanitation and biology. Scientists tracked the flea to the rat and the rat to the grain ship. They developed the first primitive anti-plague serums, and by the 1940s, the arrival of sulfonamides and streptomycin turned the most feared killer in history into a condition that could be cured with a week of pills. The Black Death was stripped of its scythe and reduced to a mere infection, a rhythmic victory of the human intellect over the chaos of nature. You are drifting now into a world where science is a steady, protective light. The dark superstitions, the vinegared masks, and the four thieves are all receding into the comforting haze of the past. The rhythm of medicine is now the rhythm of care, the steady drip of an IV, the quiet hum of a laboratory, the calm voice of a doctor. The world is understood, the enemy is known. You are safe in the hands of centuries of wisdom, a long rhythmic chain of thinkers and healers who stayed awake in the dark so that you could sleep in the light. The history of medicine is a lullaby of progress, and as the last lens is polished and the last journal is closed, you are sinking into a deep, healthy rest where the only rhythm is the quiet, automatic miracle of your own breathing. The heavy parchment of the law books closes with a satisfying rhythmic thud, and we move from the halls of Parliament back into the quiet, steam-filled rooms of the apothecary and the physician. The evolution of medicine in the wake of the plague is a story of a slow, rhythmic awakening, a transition from a world of magic and humors to a world of observation and evidence. For centuries, the human response to the pestilence was a desperate, intuitive dance. One of the most enduring legends of this time is that of the four thieves' vinegar. Imagine four men in the plague-stricken city of Marseille, brazenly robbing the houses of the dead, yet never falling ill themselves. When finally captured, they traded their secret for their lives, a potent infusion of wormwood, meadowsweet, sage, and cloves in white wine vinegar. They would douse their bodies in this acidic armor before entering the shadows. This marks a rhythmic shift in human thought, the realization that protection could be found in the physical world, in the chemistry of plants, and the ritual of cleansing. As the centuries rolled on, the rhythm of medical discovery moved from the kitchen to the laboratory. We find ourselves in the late 17th century, where the father of microbiology, Antony van Leeuwenhoek, is sitting at a wooden desk in Delft, grinding tiny glass lenses with a rhythmic circular motion of his hand. He is a draper by trade, but his curiosity is a silent fire. He takes a drop of stagnant water and looks through his lens, and for the first time in human history, the animalcules are seen. He sees a world of tiny, thrashing life, microscopic organisms that have existed since the dawn of time, invisible and unheeded. Though he does not yet connect these tiny creatures to the plague, the rhythmic ticking of his microscope lens marks the beginning of the end for the miasma theory. The invisible enemy has finally been caught in the light. This discovery was the final drumbeat in a war that had lasted 1,500 years. Once the bacterium was identified, the rhythm of the response became one of sanitation and biology. Scientists tracked the flea to the rat, and the rat to the grain ship. They developed the first primitive anti-plague serums, and by the 1940s, the Black Death was stripped of its scythe and reduced to a mere infection, a rhythmic victory of the human intellect over the chaos of nature. You are drifting now into a world where science is a steady, protective light. The dark superstitions, the vinegared masks, and the four thieves are all receding into the comforting haze of the past. The rhythm of medicine is now the rhythm of care, the steady drip of an IV, the quiet hum of a laboratory, the calm voice of a doctor. The world is understood, the enemy is known. You are safe in the hands of centuries of wisdom, a long rhythmic chain of thinkers and healers who stayed awake in the dark so that you could sleep in the light. The history of medicine is a lullaby of progress, and as the last lens is polished and the last journal is closed, you are sinking into a deep, healthy rest, where the only rhythm is the quiet, automatic miracle of your own breathing. The heavy parchment of the law books closed. Outside, the village is slowly coming back to life, but in a different shape. The survivors have pulled down the most decayed houses and used the stone to build a new, sturdier tithe barn. The rhythmic thud of the hammer and the rasp of the saw are the sounds of a civilization reasserting itself. They are not rebuilding the past, they are inventing the future. They plant apple trees in the empty gardens, the rhythmic digging of the soil, a gesture of faith in a future they will never see. As you watch Hugh, Elena, and Robin, you see the true legacy of the plague. It is not the death, but the life that followed. It is the resilience of the human spirit, the ability to find a new rhythm even when the old song has been cut short. You are part of this lineage of survivors. Their strength is in your bones. Their rhythmic persistence is in your heartbeat. The fire in the cottage is burning low now. Hugh banks the embers, the rhythmic scraping of the shovel, the last sound of the day. Elena stops her wheel. Robin is already asleep in the loft, his breathing a steady, peaceful tide. The village of Occam is tucked into the dark folds of the earth, safe and silent under the watchful moon. The history of the survivors is a lullaby of hope, a reminder that after every winter comes a spring, and after every silence a new song. You are drifting now into that same peaceful silence, protected by the endurance of those who came before you. The night is kind, the shadows are soft, and you are falling into a deep ancestral rest, where the only rhythm is the eternal heartbeat of the world. This psychological shift led to a revolution in the way humans thought about themselves. If life was short, then the individual mattered. The rhythmic study of humanism began to flourish. Scholars moved away from the abstract debates of the theologians and toward the study of poetry, history, and ethics. They looked back at the ancient Greeks and Romans, finding a rhythmic connection to a past that celebrated the human form and the human mind. The self was being discovered. Artists began to sign their paintings. Poets began to write about their own specific loves and losses. The collective, anonymous soul of the Middle Ages was being replaced by the rhythmic, distinct voice of the individual. Even the architecture of the time reflected this new psychology. The houses of the wealthy moved from being defensive fortresses to being palazzos, palaces of light and symmetry. Architects like Brunelleschi began to use the rhythm of mathematical proportion to create spaces that felt balanced and harmonious. To walk into a Renaissance courtyard is to experience a visual rhythm of arches and columns that soothes the spirit and elevates the mind. It was a physical manifestation of a world trying to bring order and beauty back to a landscape that had known only chaos and decay. As you drift through the sunlit streets of Florence, you can feel the energy of this rebirth. The carpe diem spirit is not a frantic panic, but a steady, glowing fire. It is the realization that every breath is a miracle, every meal is a feast, and every sunset is a masterpiece. The survivors of the plague did not just live, they lived with an awareness that gave their world a sharper, more beautiful edge. You are floating now on this wave of Renaissance light. The dark cloaks and the red crosses of the past are gone, replaced by the shimmering silks and the rhythmic music of a world in bloom. The history of the plague is no longer a story of loss, but a story of the magnificent, rhythmic persistence of joy. You are safe in the beauty of the present, cradled by the creativity and the courage of those who chose to dance in the wake of the storm. The night is a velvet curtain, the stars are a crown of light, and you are sinking into a deep, vibrant rest where the only rhythm is the steady, joyful beating of a heart that knows it is alive. The vibrant, rhythmic dance of the Florentine streets begins to fade, replaced by the somber, mist-covered peaks of the Derbyshire Dales in England. We have arrived in the year 1665, in the small, quiet village of Eyam. The story of Eyam is perhaps the most profound rhythmic cycle of the entire history of the plague, a story of a community that chose to stop its own heartbeat so that the heart of the world around it might continue to pulse. It is a story of ultimate stillness and ultimate sacrifice. Imagine a tailor in Eyam named George Vickers. He receives a parcel of cloth sent from London, a bundle of damp, dark hemp and silk. As he unfolds the fabric near the rhythmic warmth of his hearth, he notices it is infested with fleas, hitchhikers from the Great Plague of London. Within days, George is dead, and the rhythmic tolling of the village bell begins its mournful count. But here, the story takes a turn that differs from all the other cities we have visited. Instead of fleeing and spreading the seeds of the sickness to the neighboring towns of Sheffield and Bakewell, the people of Eyam, led by their rectors William Mompesson and Thomas Stanley, make a rhythmic collective vow. They decide to close their gates. They decide to stay. The village becomes a living island. To maintain the quarantine, they establish a boundary of stones around the perimeter of the village. No one is to cross that line. Imagine the rhythmic ritual of the cool stone, a large flat rock with holes drilled into it, filled with vinegar. Like the plague stones of the earlier centuries, this was where the villagers placed their coins to pay for food left by outsiders. There was no touch, no conversation, only the rhythmic exchange of silver for bread across a line of silent stone. This was the quarantine of the heart, a self-imposed isolation that lasted for 14 long months. Inside the village, life became a series of rhythmic, spiritual adjustments. To prevent the miasma from gathering in the closed space of the church, Mompesson moved the services outdoors to a natural amphitheater called Cooklet Delph. Imagine the villagers standing on the grassy slopes, spaced far apart, the first rhythmic practice of social distancing. The rector's voice would echo off the limestone cliffs, a steady, rhythmic cadence of hope and endurance amidst the mounting toll of the dead. They lived in a state of constant, rhythmic preparation for the end, yet they never broke their promise to the world outside. One of the most heart-wrenching rhythms of Eyam was that of the family burials. Because the churchyard became too full, and to prevent the spread of infection, families were forced to bury their own dead in their own fields. Imagine Elizabeth Hancock, who in the span of just 8 days buried her husband and 6 children with her own hands. You can hear the rhythmic thud-thud of the spade in the early morning light, a mother performing the final lonely service for her entire world. These Riley graves still stand today in a quiet field, surrounded by a stone wall, a rhythmic reminder of a strength that defies the imagination. When the plague finally burned itself out in Eyam in late 1666, the village had lost 260 of its 350 inhabitants. But the quarantine had worked. the plague did not spread to the north. The rhythmic sacrifice of this small community had saved thousands of lives. The silence that fell over Ayam afterwards was not the silence of defeat, but the silence of a profound collective peace. They had looked into the eyes of the great mortality and chosen the well-being of the stranger over their own survival. You are drifting now through the quiet lanes of Ayam. The stone cottages are peaceful, their chimneys breathing thin ribbons of smoke into the cool Derbyshire air. The boundary stones are just mossy rocks in the grass, their job long finished. The history of Ayam is a lullaby of character, a reminder that even in the darkest hours, the human spirit can choose a rhythm of grace and selflessness. You are safe in the beauty of the present, cradled by the creativity and the courage of those who chose to dance in the wake of the storm. The night is a velvet curtain, the stars are a crown of light, and you are sinking into a deep, vibrant rest where the only rhythm is the steady, joyful beating of a heart that knows it is alive. The vibrant, rhythmic dance of the Florentine streets begins to fade, replaced by the somber, mist-covered peaks of the Derbyshire Dales in England. We have arrived in the year 1665, in the small, quiet village of Ayam. The story of Ayam is perhaps the most profound rhythmic cycle of the entire history of the plague, a story of a community that chose to stop its own heartbeat so that the heart of the world around it might continue to pulse. It is a story of ultimate stillness and ultimate sacrifice. Imagine a tailor in Ayam named George Vickers. He receives a parcel of cloth sent from London, a bundle of damped, dark hemp and silk. As he unfolds the fabric near the rhythmic warmth of his hearth, he notices it is infested with fleas, hitchhikers from the Great Plague of London. Within days, George is dead, and the rhythmic tolling of the village bell begins its mournful count. But here, the story takes a turn that differs from all the other cities we have visited. Instead of fleeing and spreading the seeds of the sickness to the neighboring towns of Sheffield and Bakewell, the people of Ayam, led by their rectors William Mompesson and Thomas Stanley, make a rhythmic collective vow. They decide to close their gates. They decide to stay. The village becomes a living island. To maintain the quarantine, they establish a boundary of stones around the perimeter of the village. No one is to cross that line. Imagine the rhythmic ritual of the
Imagine a laboratory where the air is thick with the scent of antiseptic and the humid breath of the Indian Ocean. Simond is a man of quiet, rhythmic observation. He watches the rats, the black rats that have been the constant companions of the plague since the time of Justinian. He notices a pattern. The plague moves through a house only after the rats have died. He realizes that the seeds of the sickness are looking for a new home once the rat's body turns cold. But how do they travel? He looks through his microscope at the Xenoxyla chaopis, the oriental rat flea. Simond performs a rhythmic, elegant experiment that would change the world. He places a sick rat in a cage and suspended just above it, close enough for an insect to jump, but too far for physical contact, is a healthy rat. He watches as the fleas, sensing the cooling blood of the dying host, leap upward through the air. It is a microscopic bridge. When the healthy rat inevitably falls ill, Simond has his proof. The rhythm of the plague is the rhythm of the flea's heartbeat. He discovers the blocked flea,
the insect whose digestive tract is so gorged with bacteria that it cannot swallow, forcing it to bite and vomit repeatedly, a rhythmic, frantic struggle for life that inadvertently kills the human host. This discovery was the final key in the lock. The rhythm of the world's response shifted instantly from prayer and vinegar to sanitation and engineering. Cities began to rebuild their docks with concrete instead of wood to deny the rats a home. Ships were fitted with rat guards on their mooring lines, large metal discs that broke the rhythmic scurrying of the rodents. The invisible map of the plague was finally drawn in ink. We began to understand that the plague was not a supernatural judgment, but a biological accident, a collision of 3 different species in a crowded, expanding world. As the 19th century turns into the 20th, the fear that had defined the human psyche for over a millennium begins to dissolve. We see the rhythm of the first vaccines being tested. Haffkine's vaccine, developed in a makeshift lab in a corridor of a college in Mumbai. He tests it on himself first, a rhythmic act of courage that mirrors the sacrifice of the Ayam villagers. Slowly, the great mortality is pushed back into the wild places of the earth. It retreats to the marmot burrows of the steppes and the ground squirrel colonies of the American Southwest, where it remains today, a quiet, rhythmic pulse of nature that no longer threatens the survival of our species. You are drifting now through the halls of modern science. The microscopes are put away, the laboratories are quiet, and the rats have returned to the shadows, no longer the harbingers of doom. The mystery is solved. The bridge is closed. The history of the plague has moved from a scream to a whisper. You are living in the age of the answer, a time of clarity and safety. The rhythm of the world is no longer a count of the dead, but a celebration of the living. The night is deep and still. The story of the flea and the rat is now just a fascinating chapter in a long, finished book. You are sheltered by the knowledge of those who came before you, by the rhythmic persistence of the researchers and the doctors. The air you breathe is clean, the world you inhabit is understood, and your sleep is protected by the triumph of the human mind. Sink now into the final, deepest layer of rest, where the history of the world is a distant, fading echo, and the only rhythm left is the soft, rhythmic sigh of a world that is finally, truly at peace. The scientific franticness of the 19th century begins to settle into a quiet, modern hum. We move away from the white-tiled laboratories and the steam-filled ports, traveling into the present day, where the plague has retreated into the vast, silent corners of the natural world. This is the final chapter of our long journey, the modern echo. It is a story not of a roaring fire, but of a low, steady ember, a reminder of our shared past that lives quietly in the shadow of our modern achievements. Imagine the high red rock plateaus of Arizona or the sun-bleached steppes of Mongolia. Here, the rhythm of the plague continues in its ancient, primal form. It lives in the colonies of prairie dogs and the burrows of marmots, moving through the wild populations in a cycle that is as old as the hills. Today, the plague is no longer a hunter of humans, it is a biological hermit. When it occasionally brushes against our modern world, a hiker in a national park or a nomadic herder in Central Asia, the response is no longer the tolling of bells or the painting of red crosses. Instead is the rhythmic beep of a pharmacy scanner and the swift, quiet administration of antibiotics. the monster has been tamed, rendered a rare and treatable curiosity of the natural world. As you drift in the safety of the 21st century, consider what it means to be a survivor of this long history. Every one of us carries the genetic echoes of those who lived through the 1340s, the 1660s, and the 1890s. Our very immune systems are a rhythmic record of that struggle. Scientists have found that the survivors of the Black Death passed down specific protective genes to their descendants, a hidden armor that pulses in our veins today. We are quite literally the children of resilience. The history of the plague is not something that happened to us, it is something that made us. The rhythm of our modern cities, the glass towers, the clean water, the organized hospitals, is the final answer to the chaos of the medieval street. We have built a world that values the life of the individual, a world that understands the invisible, and a world that knows how to protect the vulnerable. The silence of the modern night is different from the silence of the 14th century. It is not a silence of fear or abandonment, but a silence of security. You can hear the rhythmic hum of the city or the steady breath of the wind outside your window, and you know that the world is being watched over by the collective wisdom of 1,000 years of healers. The story of the plague has come full circle. It began in the burrows of the steppe, and it has returned there. It has moved from a supernatural terror to a scientific fact, and finally into a cultural memory. We have learned the importance of the quarantine of kindness, the value of the worker, and the beauty of a life lived in the light of carpe diem. The long, winding road of the great mortality has led us here, to this moment of absolute peace. You are drifting now in a sea of deep, tranquil time. The ghosts of the past, the physicians, the sailors, the tailors of Iam, and the painters of Florence are all at rest. Their stories are told, their lessons are learned, and their rhythmic struggles have paved the way for your own quiet life. The night is a vast and gentle sea, and you are a passenger on a steady ship sailing towards the dawn. The bells are silent, the fires are out, the world is safe. The history of the plague is finished. The book is closed and placed upon the shelf. The only rhythm left is the slow, majestic rise and fall of your own chest, a rhythmic proof of life, of health, and of enduring peace. Sleep now, child of history. Sleep now, survivor of the stars. The world is quiet, the shadows are long, and you are sinking into the deepest, most restorative rest you have ever known, as the history of the world fades into the soft, eternal silence of a dreamless sleep.